The practice of Christianity among the Celts in the 4th and 5th centuries AD is a wonderful example of the variance of Christian practices in late antiquity. While much of Roman Christianity had developed under Latin influence, those in northern Britain and Ireland were unique in their cultural expressions of their faith. This was achieved by the work of many Celtic saints over the years who embedded Christian belief in the local way of life rather than imposing Roman liturgy on Celtic customs. These traditions helped to innovate and propel the Celtic Church into the Middle Ages and maintain Celtic culture in Britain and Ireland through the centuries. Today, a renewal of these practices by churchmen in and outside of the British Isles has revived much of this ancient expression of Christian belief. Many of the fantastic and wonderful exploits of the Celtic saints still possess a seemingly mythical quality which link Celtic Christianity to the ancient pagan folk tales of northwestern Europe. Rather than outright resisting Christianity like other non-Roman societies, many Celts embraced it in a manner which assimilated their local traditions. The successful results of these efforts are often attributed to the methodology of the Celtic evangelistic approach rather than to any inherent connections between Celtic spirituality and Christian doctrine. This example stands in stark contrast to the many forced conversions of the time which often involved repression and violence in their implementation. Christianity spread rapidly in the decades following Christ's death and resurrection and soon became prominent throughout the Roman Empire. Even under persecution, the momentum of this new movement led to sweeping cultural and political changes in Roman society as it grew. 3 centuries later, in the year 313 AD, Emperor Constantine instituted the Edict of Milan, which granted religious freedom and legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire for the first time. This brought rapid religious transformation in Roman lands. Christians were now free to worship Christ in the open, even though many were recently jailed, tortured, or martyred under emperors like Diocletian, who ruled less than a decade prior to the edict. Further changes came when Christianity became the official state religion of Rome under Emperor Theodosius I in the year 380 AD. From this point on, the Romans would retain key influence on Christianity throughout the empire. Many pagan temples were closed, and pagan religious festivals discouraged as discrimination in favor of Christians increased among the Romans. Societal and political pressures to convert were put on practitioners of any faith apart from Christianity. Thus, Roman Christianity soon displaced most pagan religions and began to exercise authority over Christian congregations in provinces as far away as Britain. The reign of Rome at this time was vast and extended along every shore of the Mediterranean. From Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, no power could challenge the emperor. Considering the supremacy and military might of Rome at the time, the peoples who successfully defied Roman rule or were able to resist it long enough to preserve their own customs were few yet notable. In such places, the pre-Christian mythologies of Europe, including the Germanic and Gaelic pantheons, retained the most influence and were preserved the longest. The peoples of Britannia, Germania, and the Eurasian steppe were among the few to successfully hold off Roman military influence long-term. As a result, these tribes were Christianized much differently than those areas which were under Roman rule when Christianity became the state religion. Upper Britain was where the border of Rome ended, and though extensive incursion attempts were made from multiple emperors, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Wales were left largely untouched by Rome, even at the height of their rule in the British Isles. Roman emperors often took more measures to seal off the Romano-British peoples in Lower Britain than attempt to conquer the northern Celts outright. This is apparent in defensive projects such as Hadrian's Wall, which acted as a deterrence against the tribes of the Picts in modern-day Scotland. Meanwhile, the Celtic peoples below Hadrian's Wall were gradually Latinized in the Romano-British hybrid culture. This roughly began shortly after Caesar's initial military campaign in Britannia in the year 40 AD, and flourished until 410 AD, when the legions of Rome were recalled to defend against the barbarian invasions in the continental territories. Thus, Ireland and Scotland, the two areas most prominently associated with Celtic Christianity, were among the only places in northwest Europe never to be ruled by the Romans. Ireland, isolated by the sea, remained as it had from ages long before, and was preserved as if in a time capsule. Even as Rome was withdrawing from Britannia, the Celtic Church grew in 5th century Scotland and Ireland. Owing to this isolation, the economic conditions of Scottish and Irish villages were generally much worse those in Roman cities in Lower Britain below Hadrian's Wall. Considering its economic disparities with the rest of the world, Ireland was often thought of as a backward society by their Roman neighbours across the Irish Sea. Roman influence had already brought significant economic development into the other previously Celtic areas of Europe, such as Gaul in modern-day France. Roman rule connected conquered peoples to trade networks that extended across Europe and Asia. Because of trade, markets in Lower Britain contained goods from Greece, Italy, Egypt, and Anatolia during the 1st to 4th centuries. The lack of trade with Romans meant that Irish society developed little and lacked any meaningful connection to the outside world. The absence of large towns, constant war between rival Gaelic kingdoms, and the ancient Irish religion were among the distinctions of Irish society. Their old religion was not centralized, but rather a confluence of animistic rituals directed at local spirits, gods, and demons. It was led by men and women of high learning called Druids, who inspired one of the modern names of this religion, Celtic Druidism. Very little is known about the Druids, appearing infrequently in historical literature, and seldom from the perspective of an eyewitness account. However, their significance would persist as the influences of the later Irish monastic clergy, who had extreme spiritual influence in the Church of the early Middle Ages. The image of a Druid as a priestly leader would also provide a framework for understanding the roles of Christ in the Celtic perception, and take on a new archetypal meaning for many converts. To understand how astonishing it is that Druids may be compared with Christ, one must look at the history of Druidic practices in the British Isles. While one of the only eyewitnesses of the Druids to write about them directly, Julius Caesar's report in his account of the Gallic Wars has been criticized for primarily serving his political aims. Nevertheless, this account remains one of the best sources for understanding these important historical figures. According to Caesar's account, Druids were not just religious elders, but leading social, judicial, political, and perhaps even military influences within Celtic society. Their training was lengthy, reported to be at least 20 years, and necessitated that their sacred rituals be passed on orally with no written record. Some Druids almost certainly engaged in ceremonies including human and animal sacrifice. These ceremonies involved the cutting of one slave's throat after they had been strangled, while the Druid facilitated the ritual in ceremonial robes and wielding a sacred sickle or wand. Another practice of human and animal sacrifice involved the infamous Wicker Man. This Druidic practice of building a wooden wicker man for religious rites is debated by modern historians. If Caesar is to be believed, it seems that Druids did facilitate the building of large, hollow wooden vessels in the shape of men, which were then stuffed with cattle and humans to be burned as an offering to the gods for spiritual favors and blessing. Considering this, it may sound shocking that many Celts, including the Celtic Saint Columbcille, in his famous remark, "Christ is my Druid," integrated ideas from Druidism in their Christian beliefs. To Celts, the figure of Christ was seen to be a perfect judge, ruler, and priest, and was recognized by many to resemble the roles of a Druid. The Druids were, after all, the religious, political, and the judicial leaders of their respective clans, and their duties were well known among local tribesmen. In addition to the Druidic rites, the natural environment was important to the function of early Celtic religion. There existed in all Celts a fondness of the natural world which pervaded both their paganism and eventually their Christianity. Those who sought spiritual development would often make pilgrimages to holy shrines isolated on remote islands or in sacred forests. The Celtic Church persisted in similar practices, such as offering prayers while submerged in freezing water, climbing holy mountains, and communication directly with the divine. Instead of stone temples or buildings, Celtic Christians remained outside under oak trees or large rocks in their ceremonies. It was only after a few centuries of Celtic influence passed where monasteries and cathedrals of a more permanent nature began to be commonplace. This blending of Celtic spirituality with Christian belief was a direct result of the work of many saints. Men and women such as St. Patrick, St. Bridget, and St. Columba had an enormous influence on the churches of Ireland and Scotland, as well as to Christianity in general. St. Patrick in particular is remembered for his evangelization of pagan Ireland in a time where the Irish still upheld the Druidic religion. While it is unknown when Christianity first came to the shores of Ireland, the work of St. Patrick was a definitive indication of the religious transformation there. Across the Irish Sea in the Romano-British lands of Wales, Patrick's family lived in a small village close to the sea in the late 4th century. One day, the village where Patrick and his family lived was attacked by marauders in a sea raid, and he was taken captive to Ireland while he was still a boy. Through many hard years, he worked among his captors and was only able to escape after a daring venture in which he was divinely aided by God. When Patrick returned to his home, he did not have any ambitions to return to Ireland, but one day he received a dream in which the Irish men and women cried out to him, "Walk among us." It was at this point that Patrick, burdened now for the salvation of the people who had subjected him to suffering, made preparations to return to Ireland. After St. Patrick had trained vigorously for 15 years in France, his bishop sent him out for the expressed purpose of evangelization. Patrick would spend his life among the Irish and would come to be associated with them forever. In Irish folklore, there are many traditions which seem to incorporate the historical St. Patrick with myths and tales of Ireland's pre-Christian pantheon. Various signs, miracles, and magic feats were supposedly performed by Patrick in spiritual contests with Druidic sorcerers. The only account of St. Patrick that he himself authored contains a short refutation and small bibliography called The Confessions of St. Patrick and The Letter to Coroticus. These documents and several other historical records from later writers have been able to sketch out Patrick from the folk tales and distinguish him from other Celtic saints of the period. Another Celtic saint named Bridget was involved in a fair number of magical stories as well. For some Christian Celts, Bridget was a controversial character, as she was most likely a direct reinterpretation of the Celtic pagan goddess, also named Bridget. The deeds of both Bridget the goddess and Bridget the saint overlap in theme at times, and the historical and mythological remain difficult for historians to separate. Nevertheless, St. Bridget remains a very important and notable figure, not least because she was a woman. Though many female priests seem to have existed in the Druidic religion before Christianity, this was still a unique characteristic of the Celtic Church among other Christian sects. There were women in positions of leadership and power who were active in Celtic society throughout history. One such example was the Britannic queen Boudicca, who led one of the largest revolts against the Romans in British history. As Christianity replaced Druidism, this feature of woman in prominent positions was maintained against the more common patriarchal societies of the time. The Celtic saint, Columba, or Columcille, spent his life among the Scottish peoples or Picts. The efforts of Columba, along with his 12 Irish apostles, would become legendary within the church. Columba was very active in starting new churches in the Hebrides Isles of Scotland. Towards the end of his life, he also established a school at the monastery he had founded on the island of Iona. His influence and life are remembered throughout Scotland, and he was canonized as the patron saint of Derry. As another result of the work of these early Celtic saints, Celtic monastic traditions would grow in popularity and spread to mainland Europe in the coming centuries. In addition to being a place of spiritual learning, Celtic monasteries were also centers of intellectual learning and scholarship. They preserved education and literacy in Europe through the turbulence of the Middle Ages before any of the European universities were founded. This preservation of academic and intellectual literature became a distinct trait of the Celts, and their monks were renowned for their skill in copying religious texts. These scholar priests were also artistic and brought their skill into the creation of beautiful manuscripts such as the Book of Kells. Due to the lack of urbanization, most of the dioceses in the later Catholic Church in Ireland were not developed until the 8th and 9th century, when larger cities were established following Viking colonization. This meant that there was not centralized control over a bishopric, and that local Irish bishops were often directly involved in the community in which they lived. These small, interspersed communities promoted close friendships and teaching relationships among the patrons. These were not large congregations in cathedrals. Instead, they were small hermitages or monastic communities which were optimized to provide Christians with opportunities for companionship and encouragement. These small churches delegated leadership opportunities for various members of the community and met in places of common reverence, such as in the forest, hilltops, or at times in their stone huts. Close interpersonal relationships between individuals was integral to the development and longevity of Irish monasticism. Among their distinct concepts for relationship was that of the soul friend, or anam cara in the Gaelic language. This term was applicable to many of the strong friendships which characterized the communities of Celtic monks living in close proximity. It is from these relationships that strong prayer, accountability, and companionship developed not just in the lives of the saints and clergy, but in the lay people as well. This practice was encouraged as a means of obtaining strength and sharing the wisdom of other brothers or sisters in the faith. Though often friendships, these relationships could also include marriages and mentorships within a small group of Celtic Christians. As a result of this, many of these disciples were eager to serve and suffer for each other. The Celtic Church is a unique expression of Christian belief and developed in contrast to many of the conversion efforts that were enacted in other parts of Europe at the time. The extreme violence in Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons, as well as the various crusades in the Middle East, are unfortunately among the more typical examples of conversion in late antiquity Christendom. This was presumed by many to be the only means of Christianization in pagan areas. Yet, while maintaining elements of its pre-Christian appeal, the Celts did in fact exchange their old paganism for belief in the redemption through Jesus Christ. After Druidism, the traditions of nature pilgrimage, isolated hermitages, community living, and feats of memorization became expressions of newfound Christian faith. They directed their worship to the God of the Bible instead of the old gods and goddesses. The uniqueness of Celtic practice was made possible by the structure of its ancient communal society, its non-violent presentation to Celtic tribes, and the diligent work of the Celtic saints. The Celtic Church was then and is today one of the most colourful and vibrant expressions of religious belief in the world.